2010, the antitrust agencies released a new version of the merger guidelines. In their revision, they de-emphasized the usefulness of looking at market shares to determine that a merger might harm competition. The rewrite was the agency's effort to reshape the law to provide themselves with much-needed flexibility, after the private sector forced them to change by persuading courts that market share should not decide outcomes. The private sector is responding to the government's enhanced ability to challenge mergers between innovative firms with lots of power in markets where boundaries are not easily defined. We discussed this development with some of today's top antitrust lawyers, including Paul Dennis, primary draftsman of the 1992 merger guidelines. These experts walked us through why the change was necessary, how it affected the practice, and the role of market shares going forward.
This has been a long time in the making. If you go back to even the Reagan years, it was really the start of it when Bill Baxter came in, revolutionized merger guidelines in 1982. And what's followed since then, the 84 guidelines, the 92 guidelines that I worked on, and even the current 2010 guidelines have moved the agencies away from simple numerical type analysis more toward telling a story. And the reason that became important is that they were losing cases when they focused just on numbers. The defense was almost a laydown. The government would come in with a set of numbers. The defense would come in with business executives who looked like the judge's neighbors and who could actually explain how the business worked. So the government has been moving in the direction of telling a better story and has had better luck in court as a result.
I think that the agencies, particularly in the 2010 merger guidelines, have explained both to private practitioners as well as to, I think, the courts, which is an intended audience there, that the modeling is much more complex than that. And as a result, I think that they are essentially putting the world on notice that they have a lot of tools in their arsenal.
Carl Shapiro, who was the chief economist for the Antitrust Division, is a major proponent of that approach, and the division has been focusing more on actual competitive effects of mergers because there are many flaws in the traditional market definition tools.
The structural framework, which was used for decades both by the courts and the agencies, as economic tools became more sophisticated and experience grew over time, people began to doubt the accuracy of those structural presumptions, particularly in moderately concentrated markets. 3-2s and 2-1s, people generally still thought that was a meaningful metric, but as the number of competitors in the market increased and there was greater certainty or uncertainty about entry barriers or the lack thereof, and just econometric tools improved, there became less confidence in simply doing long division as a way to make enforcement decisions.
There's an odd reaction to the losses where the government started to move away from market definition because it was a cause of defeat in court. So the 2010 guidelines, I think, were built around trying to preserve litigation wins and to tell the courts, we don't have to go through this hoop called market definition first, because what was happening is they were losing cases when they had to define a market, and the defense got good at picking holes in the technical aspects of market definition. So they said, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to skip that stage and go to a stage where we think we're stronger. So that really motivated them to go in the direction of competitive effects. But from a defense perspective, ultimately that's what it's all about, is what's going to be the effect of the merger. So we're happy to have the government there talking about competitive effects. I think they still need to prove a market if they're going to go to court. But for an investigation where you're working, back and forth with the agencies, we don't spend much time talking about markets anymore. It's just not an issue.
Even though the agencies thought as a technical matter they could still define a market, when you had it faced with the challenge of presenting that in court, they ran into significant obstacles. Cases like SunGard, Oracle, even Whole Foods, all of that became difficult. So those difficulties, not just for a matter of sort of economic accuracy, but litigation realities, push the agencies to emphasize competitive effects, at least alongside structural work.
It wasn't enough that the government changed its practices. The agency needed to update the guidelines to conform to their practices, as the guidelines have a tendency to shape the law when their language appears in the decisions of judges who presided over merger cases.
As you litigate a case, you incorporate the guidelines into the analysis, and the courts gradually then incorporate the guidelines into their analysis. So although the guidelines aren't law, they end up being talked about in decisions. I think that happened in the H&R Block case.
Yeah. But there's no doubt the way the language in the H&R Block case reads is quite different than the way the decisions read in Oracle and SunGard. And that's not necessarily just a reflection of, it could be a reflection of different judicial views, but I also think an underemphasized aspect of all this is both the agencies and the courts, as they gain more experience and more practice doing this, inevitably become more sophisticated and more comfortable with the analysis. So I think it was unreasonable or perhaps overly optimistic to expect that you could simply flip the switch from structural work to competitive effects and overnight produce litigation victories. But over time, I think the courts are becoming more accustomed to that argument, and I expect you'll see cases where the courts are quite comfortable explaining both the distinctions in the analysis and also the significant overlap in the analysis.
Many in the antitrust community fear that over-reliance on competitive effects might give both the government and private parties the opportunity to use economics as a tool to mislead the courts.
One of the criticisms of the guidelines, at least from the people at the Department of Justice who have to litigate these cases, is that the guidelines give too many opportunities for defense counsel to pick apart the department's cases, because the guidelines allow for all kinds of different analyses and effects, and it's hard to sort of figure out what's the correct one to be using. Do you think that's a problem with the new guidelines?
Well, I've heard actually the opposite side of that asserted, which is companies are not happy that the guidelines seem to be so flexible, and they don't like the fact that the guidelines seem to be open to a bunch of different approaches depending on the matter. And companies say that decreases certainty, right? And part of the idea of the guidelines is to help companies know more or less what the line is.
There are also problems in focusing too much on effects. I mean, let's talk about what antitrust is really about. It's about prediction. Everything that's interesting in this field seems to me to be about predicting the future. Whether it's will this merger raise prices? Will this merger reduce innovation? Will it reduce choice? It's all in the future. So what do we know about the future? Well, we don't know very much about the future, and our ability to predict is quite limited.
You know, I think it's been good for antitrust generally. And now with that, there's a caveat, but let's talk about the good first. I do think that qualitatively decision-making is better than it was when we were thinking more purely about structure. And I certainly think that, again, with the data available now and more complex models, we can get at more qualitative decision-making, which is ultimately good for both sides. It's good for the antitrust agencies, and it's good for private business as well. I do think there is something to be careful about in that, and that is with the additional complexity of the new models, with the availability of such rich data, it also opens up the possibility of misuse. That and I'm not saying intentional misuse here, but that data and models can be applied in the wrong circumstances to get bad results.
When we develop a system, a process that emphasizes proving the future, we've pretty much already determined the outcome, which is if you're going to go to court and there's a high level of proof as to what's going to happen, you lose. That is to say, the firms that want to do the merger are going to win more often than not, because the burden of foretelling the future in a way that's convincing to a judge, it's storytelling.
And I'm really taken by Commissioner Russia's sort of dissent and commentary when the guidelines were issued, which was, these guidelines have been written by economists and we should be wary. And I think that's an appropriate instruction. Too often, I know for myself, having litigated cases both for the government and in private practice for defendants, the government relies too much on an economic perspective when they litigate merger cases, and when they don't sort of base things on the hard real-world facts, that often leads to their demise. So to the extent that the merger guidelines are too much of an economic approach and not enough of an approach on hard facts, I think they'll be somewhat problematic.
I think that merger policy is going to become much more flexible and fluid. It will empower the agencies to experiment with different methods of assessing markets, and also challenging certain mergers that maybe before would have gone through under a more bright line analysis.
The tech sector is one area where the government might use the new language to its advantage, which is forcing the lawyers that represent tech companies to formulate their responses.
You talked about the future of merger being more flexible and possibly reaching types of deals that may have not been reached before by current merger jurisprudence. Could you think of some examples of possibly industries or types of mergers that might fall into that category?
Certainly technology and the communications industry, where there is a challenging balance between maintaining growth and innovation in the markets and the industry as a whole. That is certainly an area where experimentation may lend itself.
The innovation story tends to happen when you have kind of nascent, smaller competitors. Maybe not even the market is recognizing that they're competitors yet, but the incumbents recognize that these are the sorts of folks who could displace us. And that's the sort of antitrust intervention that I think is appropriate.
Well, if you look at the high-tech markets and the rapid change that occurs in those types of industries and some of the challenges that are presented with network effects, it is hard to try to fit that into a market definition, market structure analysis. I think it's really important to look at the dynamics.
But there are analytical problems with the competitive effects analysis, particularly when you're talking about something like software. Typically, software vendors charge license fees based on the number of users. And of course, the cost of providing the software is the same whether you have 10 users or 10,000 users, and the cost of actually manufacturing that disk or whatever the medium is almost nothing. So you end up with a lot of what appears to be price discrimination in the software industry, and some people would take the position that any price discrimination is direct evidence of anti-competitive effects. And I think when you apply that analysis in the context of software, for example, it doesn't work very well. It can give you false positives.
If you're just going to engage in a backward-looking exercise that's focused purely on market structure, you'll probably get it wrong most of the time in an industry where there's rapid change. So looking at competitive dynamics, looking at trends, looking at the way competition occurs in that market, who are the customers, who are the suppliers, what's happening with intellectual property, all of those things need to be taken into account so that the analysis is more holistic, so to speak.
The change, market structural analysis remains a fundamental part of the merger review process, a key mechanism for predicting effects and a legal requirement in any agency lawsuit against a proposed transaction.
Historically, you had this notion that there's a presumption of adverse effects that could be drawn from high market share, high concentration, and a large change in concentration from a deal. Right? So the direction was pushing you toward a case. And then the question was, could you rebut this presumption or overcome this presumption somehow, whatever that meant? Where market share and structural evidence is today, it's a screen. Okay? And I think the best way to think of it is, can we get past this screen? If we can, we're going to do a detailed dive into competitive effects. If we can't get past this screen because we've defined a market where the shares of the emerging firms are really small, we should stop. Right? There's not going to be a substantial effect. It's not worth spending any more time on. Let's take those resources and put them to more productive use.
While it's clearly been a substantial trend in development in agency practice to focus more on competitive effects analysis and less on structural analysis and market shares, 9 out of 10 investigations or potential investigations still begin with the question, what are the market shares? I guarantee you that the staff that gets that HSR filing, when they start to talk about it with their group and with their managers, both at DOJ and the FTC, does a rough cut at what those shares are, and then thinks, based on those shares, is that a reasonable basis to open an investigation? And it's certainly the case that many second requests are still issued heavily based on structural analysis.
This was a Bureau of Economics working paper study done by Dan Hoskin and others. And in that paper, they were looking at whether a structural presumption actually proved helpful in retail type cases. And in the retrospective, they found that looking back, deals that they had cleared in markets with high concentration ratios actually did seem to suggest that there were higher prices resulting from those deals. And interestingly, deals where the markets were defined as either moderately concentrated or unconcentrated actually resulted in lower prices for consumers. So that tends to add some support to the use of structural presumptions in retail mergers.
I think that market definition is always going to be a fundamental part of most antitrust cases. I do think that where you'll see a change and where you're starting to see a change is the willingness, certainly on the part of the antitrust enforcement agencies and possibly eventually on the part of the courts, to see harm first and then back into the market structure and market definition from there. Sometimes in identifying a relevant market, you can start where you think you see harm and build a market around that.
Market definition is a really important discipline on these cases. If you don't define a market and you jump straight to competitive effects, you have no way to scale the effects. Right? You end up with trivial cases, essentially. But market definition focuses you on, is there a substantial effect here that's worth bringing out the armada of federal government or state government enforcement against the deal?